Well, this is a little segment that I'm looking to do, which is to introduce to you some of my friends who also love music, and it's been a big bond in terms of people that have been in my life. So I'm introducing you now to a gentleman that I used to work with, and I'll tell you a little story about how Rick and I met a little bit later. Rick, why don't you just introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Rick. Brian and I go quite a ways back, actually. We have known each other, obviously personally now, but professionally, I think is where it all started, and worked together on a number of music-related projects, strangely enough. We live in Vancouver. Pretty extensive background with regard to music, movies, all that type of stuff. Played in bands many years ago. Still own a number of instruments. Huge music fan.
So, Rick, tell me a little bit about the kind of music that you've listened to in your life. Give me some albums or some genres that really have been meaningful for you.
Well, I consider myself pretty lucky to have grown up when I did, because the periods that I was able to kind of transition through were really the 60s, starting in the 60s and right through up till probably current times today. I think, like most people, the Beatles was a big kind of bellwether for me, and the Stones clearly for me personally. But I did like a lot of the bands that came up through the 60s into the 70s. I was one of those people that actually, when Hotel California came out, I thought to myself, it's all over for this stuff. I had almost zero interest in some of that. Buying, for example, the New York Dolls' first record in 1973 was a huge wake-up call for me. And buying, I think that same year as well, Iggy Pop and the Stooges' Raw Power changed a lot of things for me in terms of my own taste and expanded my taste. So, my own tastes, I think, cover a variety of genres, including jazz. I know a lot of people say that stuff, but having been in the industry for a long time, and also just personally growing through these different periods, it's allowed me to expand my taste and listen to many, many things, right from post-punk to jazz to ambient to some pop, early Beatles. It just really is all over the map a bit. And as long as it's good and it's got some feeling and it's got some meaning, I'm typically very much into it. I think if you're a good musician, the core of what you want to be doing is not only creating your music, but also playing it to an audience. There have been some great live records over the years. The record I'm going to talk about today is Delaney and Bonnie Friends with Eric Clapton. This record actually came out in 1970 in the spring and was recorded in December 1969. It's a very interesting period for a number of reasons. Number one, I guess, is that Eric Clapton was probably at maybe his peak here with regard to popularity, I think, playing with different bands. The overall context, I think, around the period is that the first band record, Music from Big Pink, was, I think, instrumental in really, really getting a number of artists to reassess what they were doing. And this happened particularly, I think, with Eric Clapton, who had huge notoriety at the time. Clapton is God, certainly, as a fantastic guitar player, playing with Cream. Cream broke up. Shortly afterwards, it was announced that he had joined a band called Blind Faith, which, together with Ginger Baker, who originally from Cream, and Steve Winwood from Traffic, and Rick Gretsch on bass, was a four-piece band, released one record only, and did a tour almost immediately with hardly any material and just the one record. There was a decision made to hire Delaney and Bonnie as an opening act, and I think Clapton began to reassess his own taste and what he was doing. I think it was one thing for him to be recognized as a guitar player. It was another thing for him to be boxed in, so to speak. I think he wanted to grow as a singer, as a songwriter. I think watching Delaney and Bonnie open for Blind Faith in 1969 was a huge eye-opener, to the point where he would not only watch the shows, and he would start joining the shows. I think at the end of the tour, for the Blind Faith tour, Clapton ended up joining Delaney and Bonnie Friends. And I think the story with Delaney and Bonnie is equally as interesting, because Delaney and Bonnie, Delaney Bramlett began as a musician in the southern U.S., played on different records, but first point of notoriety was probably that he was on one of the original 60s television shows that did showcase music in the early 60s. There were two, Shindig and Hullabaloo. And he began on Shindig, interestingly enough. Eventually, he ended up on the Stax label. Bonnie Bramlett, who he had married, her career start actually is interesting as well because she had a blues background, certainly playing with people like Albert King when she was like 13 years old. Eventually ended up playing with Ike and Tina Turner as one of the Ikettes. So that gives you an idea on her own background, I think, and also her strength as a vocalist. The two of them did, I think, one record on Stax at the time. Not a lot of success with the record, but there was a tremendous amount of interest around, I think, the two of them in the music community. The fact that their music was very kind of, it's an overused term, and I think, again, because of the band, a roots-based type band, Southern U.S., Southern, and I hate the term Southern rock, but from the sense that an incorporation of blues, rhythm and blues, rock and roll, soul, all these different elements. And I think that's really what attracted Clapton. They did a tour in '69 and broke up shortly after that. This record was recorded in Croydon. There were a number of other shows as well that were re-released later in 2010 on a box set. But this record is, in my opinion, a really important turning point for music in the 60s. There are a number of records you could make the argument for. This particular record showcases really Clapton as a sideman playing in the band. So the guitar is not right up front. Anybody who, I remember I was young at the time, younger, and when the record first, I was dying to get the record because I was an Eric Clapton fan, and when I bought the record, I remember thinking to myself, oh my God, this is not Clapton playing Crossroads or anything like that. This was really him being part of a band. The material itself is fantastic. The band that was incorporated on this band, everybody went on to do other things. In terms of the players on the band, it's everybody from Jim Price on trumpet and Bobby Keys, who both later went on to play with the Rolling Stones on the 1972 STP tour, to also other people, Jim Keltner, Carl Rattle played bass on here, and Carl Rattle and Jim Keltner both went on to play with Clapton in Derek and the Dominoes. Many of the people on this record also went on later in the following year in 1970 to play with Joe Cocker on the Mad Dogs and Englishmen tour. So the influence of these folks with regard to music at the time, there was a distinct shift that happened towards more roots-based type stuff. Clapton recorded his solo record, the first solo record for him, Eric Clapton. There's also a version of that record that was produced by Delaney Bramlett. If you buy the extended version of the album available today, those sessions are also available. Much cleaner sounding in my view, a little more roots oriented in terms of basic sound. But this record itself is a real milestone. The performances are fantastic. This is a band playing at its prime, playing things they love. Clapton, again, as a guitar player, is in the background here, but does shine on a number of tracks. There's a track called Coming Home that has some great guitar work. It's a track co-written with him and Bonnie Bramlett. Production on this record, one of the producers on it is Jimmy Miller. Personal favorite of mine, I think Jimmy Miller had an unbelievable track record from late 60s into the mid 70s, probably right up till the Rolling Stones decided to part ways with him. Arguably, some of the best Rolling Stones records were produced by Jimmy Miller as well. A great drummer, actually, but he co-produced this record. The engineering, Glenn Johns. Again, a lot of classic personalities on here. And the material on here varies from some different standards to, there's a little Richard medley, for example. That's a closing thing. There are a number of things on here. Poor Elijah, which is a great track that has now been covered by everybody, including the Black Crowes at various points. So it's a must-own record in my view. I think if you really want to understand the transition of music from 1969 into 70, and I don't think there's any specific dividing line there, but it definitely represents a shift from some of the more psychedelic and really kind of points the way towards a lot of what happened in the early 70s with singer-songwriters, Southern rock. You know, there wouldn't have been, you could argue maybe that the Allman Brothers were even part of this whole milieu of artists. So Delaney and Bonnie and Friends on tour with Eric Clapton. Interesting note too, final thing I'll leave with you. This cover photo was taken by the manager of Delaney and Bonnie, I think a guy named Bobby Weinstein, who originally was a photographer. And this car and the feet that you see hanging out of the car, the feet on this are actually Bob Dylan's. And Weinstein was originally a photographer of Bob Dylan at one point. And they decided to shot in the desert somewhere. So who knows what the heck they were doing while they were in the desert. But it's a great cover, certainly memorable, one of a kind, just like this record. One final little tidbit on here. We're going to do a little trivia and ask the question, which Beatle is playing on this record? Actually, none of them. However, George Harrison is credited on the record as a Misterioso. And if you're a music nut and you know the band Cream, you'll also know that on Goodbye Cream, the song Badge also shows a person playing guitar with Eric Clapton by the name of Angelo Misterioso, aka George Harrison. So there's that connection. Actually, Harrison did play with Delaney and Bonnie and Friends with Eric Clapton on many, many dates of the tour. I believe it's captured actually on the box set. Unfortunately, he's not on this record, but he did play slide and some other things with the tour. One thing I should also mention as well that I forgot to bring up earlier was that everybody on this record, for the most part, was involved in George Harrison's All Things Must Pass. And if you listen to the Apple Jam, for example, on there, a number of the people in this band were playing on Apple Jam. So again, the legacy of the musicians is incredible with respect to where they played, when they played, who they played with. This is a keeper.